Alright everyone, I wanted to make a video fleshing out something that I've been alluding to for some time, which is really the importance of the growth of fringe movements as applied to the US and the EU right now, although really this takes place through the paradigms in all sorts of places within the world. It happened, of course, you saw it happen maybe in the USSR at first. You have a small group of commies and they're like inconsequential, and then, pretty soon the Red Guard is marching through the streets, shooting people and committing multiple large-scale acts of genocide that you don't learn about them in the history books because it's inconvenient, but they happened anyway. The Holodomor, actually, don't be a denier of it because otherwise you're human scum. But I wanted to go through the basic 5 stages, at least as I outline them, of how this works. My thoughts about the current situation, especially in Europe, but also, again, to an extent, a lesser degree here within the United States. I see a big difference emerging between sort of two competing paradigm theaters right now, almost like it's a war. The strategies are different, the actors are different, the situations, the level of suppression, the degree to which the paradigm has progressed, they're all somewhat different. There are similarities, though. They're following the same basic trajectory, just one lagging behind the other. In the first stage of a fringe group, now with fringe I don't mean a negative connotation, I mean a group outside of the established norm. In the first case, in the first step of the growth of that group, it is tiny. We're talking a really, really tiny number of people, less than 1% of a population, probably less than 0.1%, a small kernel of idea. And in this step, because it's tiny, because it's insular and basically an echo chamber, it makes itself fanatic. Its members will tend to outcompete members of the establishment in debating, in going out and pushing their message, because they're zealots, they're fanatics, honestly. They're more purist. There isn't a lot of challenge to the idea internally, so then they can go forth and spend all of their effort challenging outside ideas. At least situationally, they occasionally thus score victories, and at least slowly they begin growing over time. They begin absorbing new members. In the second stage, the fringe is still very small. This is the 1 or 2% of the population stage. We're talking a very, very small minority. It's still more zealous than the establishment. It's still capable of outcompeting them on a debate stage. But now because it's now known about, it's no longer invisible to the average person. A normie is going to know that this movement exists. Like you would think of libertarianism maybe in the mid-2000s. People begin to know what it actually means. Or the alt-right, maybe a couple years ago, all of a sudden people are saying, well, what's this alt-right thing? They never heard the term before. There were people with the same views for years and years, but they never heard it encapsulated in a term. They knew nothing about it. As the normies get exposed to it, what it's seen as is the fringe begins to moderate itself maybe slightly. It becomes slightly more palatable because normies start coming in and tempering the movement overall. In the second stage, as it grows, it's because it's small and fringe, it's exciting to people who are disaffected and bored. Essentially, people who are bored with the status quo, they're angry to some degree, they have negative feelings. In the third stage, the fringe has grown larger and it's gained semi-acceptance. This is what I would put it as. It begins to absorb the opposite of any other competing fringe that's coming up. See, they don't act alone. Typically, if a fringe exists, part of the establishment over time, feeling threatened and realizing the centrists can't stop it, will form their own counter-fringe. These two groups then, this is the stage the United States is currently in. They begin to feed off of one another. Europe is in late stage 2 right now. This is a trend that I believe is beginning within Europe. You see now beginning the rise, small scale, but it's starting, of groups that are further right and further left. They would have been unpalatable to the last paradigm. They would have been considered complete fanatics. They're gaining quasi-acceptance. Here, they've already done so. The alt-left has already gained partial acceptance among the further left Democrats. People who are more standard garden variety liberals have begun to look at the further right. They feel threatened enough that they're saying, oh, maybe there's something this Antifa material. People on the right looked at the left and they began to see the social justice warrior. Really, the far left predates the far right. Well, I see. My theory is that the alt-right, the new right, all of these different movements, and associated the further out there libertarians, constitutionalism, as these groups grow, they're growing as a reaction to, in the late 2000s already, the primordial growth of a far, far left that made the Pelosi liberals look like corporate centrists, which is true. I mean, it's not a lie. It's definitely a reality that that's the case. But a far left, and not a far left as in, well, we're Union Blue, really far left fiscally. Or we're far left, we're progressive, and therefore we want, equality and tolerance. Like the further left of my generation, totally different. The further left of the early young adult millennials, as we began to vote, still fanatically far left, but it was an anti-war and stop the surveillance far left. Basically the opposite of the far left we have now. It almost had more in common with the new right, arguably, in some ways. These two fringes will argue to people on the fringes of the fringe. That is, people that are not 100% centrist. They're on the edges of centrism. They're on the outside of the Overton window. They're just barely within it. They're closer, arguably, to one of these two fringes. They're certainly closer to it than the other fringe. They begin to debate one another, and they begin to make their argument to people that are simply on the margins of that fringe. Hey, stick with us. The other fringe, look at them. They're scary. Now, because, in truth, there are the same number, generally, of violent zealots and crazy people on both fringes. Generally speaking, it's not 100% accurate this time around. I think the right has more sane individuals at the moment than the left does. That could be due to differential growth, honestly, instead of ideology itself. But if I'm center-right, and I look at the far right and the far left, I have more in common probably with the far right. Ultimately, if I feel threatened by the other side more, I'm going to tend to gravitate towards the right. The two poles then begin to grow larger. Eventually, in the fourth stage, the two fringes are locked in battle. The center itself may still be the largest. The establishment is still larger than these fringes, but unfortunately for them, those two fringes combined are now a substantial enough proportion of the population, a large minority, if not a small majority of the population. They're no longer capable of doing anything. The government becomes strangulated. Statehood begins to collapse. Ultimately, the society itself, in a properly functioning system, the paradigm ends with the strangulation of society. That is, the government doesn't collapse. You don't have a revolution or anything. You don't have a total collapse of the nation itself. You simply have a collapse of the paradigm. In an unhealthy nation, you get maybe like the collapse of a USSR situation. Or you get a mass purge as the establishment finds some leader willing to, activate the guards, so to speak, and just lay waste all of their enemies, thus resetting things back to an earlier stage. They begin to bubble up over and over again, and each time it gets worse, and eventually they collapse anyway, but it staves off the inevitable. In the fifth stage, as the two fringes battle, you can get one of two situations. Those fringes begin to relax back towards the center, forming an actual dichotomous system. Or you can have more than two fringes, potentially. Either that, or one of them essentially destroys the other falls out of fashion, the Overton window shifts to the right or the left, and then you have, what I see, is that the last paradigm ends, really. We're talking with Obama liberalism displacing older liberalism, and making use of more racial and sex-based wedge issues. We have almost, in a way, I like to say this, we have an identitarian style of leftism. That is, the identity that they want is multicultural and multinational. It's no longer about having a nation-state, having an America, per se. It's about maintaining a globalized order. In Europe, we see the same thing maybe with the Merkelites and some of these other groups. Now, they're all over the board on many issues. They can be fiscally further left or right. They can be more or less onerous and authoritarian. The hope is that if you have a corrupted establishment, at the very least, it has an element of libertarianism within it and isn't totally totalitarian in some form or another. But what can happen is that one fringe destroys the other. And ideologically, it doesn't have to purge them violently. It simply has to cause the other fringe to become unpalatable. It has to become large enough to be victorious over it. The other fringe is demoralized, collapses, and then you wait for a new paradigm to emerge over time. What I see right now, for instance, is that the far left, which had a significant lead over the far right for a very long time, has now begun to decline. the right is still growing. There's a reason why all of the resources of the globalists right now are being mobilized against the right wing. It's because it's growing more quickly. It poses a greater threat to the world establishment. The left, not so much. It's still a vocal minority. The left is maybe even a step behind the right in its actual growth. The problem for them is that they don't even really have a leadership potential. The way in which they've structured the paradigm that they want to create is itself intrinsically unstable. It's less stable than basically a dying establishment, certainly less stable than the kind of hierarchical systems typically generated by the right wing. Therefore, they're left with street violence. Unfortunately, that makes them look a lot more threatening in the information age than people on the far right when they just, they sort of stand around chanting their slogans and wearing business suits. It's a little bit of a difference in the optics there. The hooded, Molotov cocktail-waving individual, probably. Although they may seem cooler to a very small minority of the population, like, well, it's pretty cool, man, I can throw rocks at police or whatever. Ultimately, they are not palatable to anyone within the center. But that nice fashy-haired young dude with the business suit looks like maybe the kind of person you have a cup of coffee with. Ultimately, the optics are different. Martin Luther King understood this. He's like, oh, we're going to march in suits and ties. Trust me, it's a better idea. And he was right. There's a reason why they killed him off. The government probably knocked him off, by the way. And a lot of people, even a lot of leftists, understand that fact. So yeah, there's some stages of the growth of a fringe. Right now, again, the United States, we should thank our lucky stars for this. Populism is still bubbling up much more quickly than anything else within the right. The only reason, by the way, I can tell you this, the only reason why MAGA populism is considered far right and really out there is because a lot of people were dragged far left during the Obama era. Because the last sort of political movement on the right was Bushism. It was extremely warmongering. It was globalistic, by the way. Extremely abusive towards the Constitution, abusive towards the economy, and had very few redeeming facets. George W. Bush was one of the worst pieces of crap ever to hold his office. He collapsed the populistic right, giving rise to the far right. Because the further right realized, hey, these people are weaklings, they don't have an idea of strategy. So now you've got a combination of populism and nativism on one end, which is sort of further right, but it's still on the margins of the center, which is quite palatable to a lot of people. And the further right, which is like beyond the new right, you've got, people, a Richard Spencer song, and it doesn't even have anything to do with the fiscal side of things. Ultimately, it has to do solely with the social side and with the concept of nation state versus globe. That's the only real argument to be had there. Everything else is totally malleable. In fact, it's quite chaotic. There's no real consensus. Are we going to have, a state that's, more corporatized and right-wing? Are we going to have centralization? Is it oligarchic and a meritocratic style of system? Or is it a dictatorship? Is it going to be kind of a republic with just, an ethno-constitution? What exact form is it going to take? Who knows? So it's quite interesting to think about these things. But I would say, the European Union, one reason I predict it heads off a cliff over the next few decades is specifically because of this. The centrists there are already strangulated because of the government situation. The way the EU functions, it's almost self-destructive anyway. Slow, inefficient, clunky, a lot of red tape, very bureaucratic and legalistic, quite authoritarian. That's not palatable to people on the further left either. And so they're going to start opposing the far right, and those two sides will grow along with whatever political movements are part of them. You see, there's an extreme amount of growth among groups like maybe the Soldiers of Odin. They're not even like a lawless group. They're not really a gang. They're more what we would consider in the United States anyway, more of a militia, an ethnic militia of sorts, but that's the form that they take. They don't go around in hoods and do drive-bys or something. But here's the problem. You've got a separate debate in Europe, more so than here. Here it's about illegal immigration. There it's about refugees for the most part. It's about them attempting to create a borderless European superstate. That's what Merkel wants. That feeds social alienation and arguably makes the far right grow far more quickly than the far left there. The far left can only grow as a reaction to the growth of the far right, but the far right will always be ahead of it, because they're being fed by social wedge issues of all variants and manners. They've also got the cool factor, potentially, because they're the ones primarily being censored. There's no open attempt in most of Europe today, especially Western Europe, to censor the Communist Manifesto. There's no attempt to jail people for saying "Hail Karl Marx," but there are definitely attempts to jail people for doing things typically associated with the further right. So the warning to the European Union is, if you want to survive at all, you need desperate reform. You need to decentralize the EU. You need to implement more protections from member states in an economic and nationalistic fashion. And you need to cut down on the censorship severely. Only the open flow of ideas, especially online, can save the European Union at this point. It's beginning to decay. It's got cancer. You need to excise that tumor. That tumor is totalitarianism. In your quest to stave off far-right totalitarianism, you have endorsed the tactics of totalitarians in attempting to suppress them. It's been tried before. It won't work. It was attempted in Weimar Germany. It didn't work very well. People beat each other in the streets, dying by the thousands. And then because of the fiscal mismanagement of the German government at the time, it didn't work too well. A good case was made by all those commies and Nazis for a while, because they said, hey, well, the Republicans and the Social Democrats aren't helping you. Look at the economy. Look at, there's people like, there's violence everywhere, people starving and shit. Well, what are you going to do? You can vote for people who want to collectivize you all, or you can vote for people who want to collectivize you all. But they got two different plans to do that. Ultimately, people under that much stress are more willing to adopt a totalitarian mentality. People are feeling generally good about things, less so generally. And that's why the rise of MAGA populism, I think, and the rise of a new American economy, which I believe will be stronger than before, an American society that is more stable, hopefully, if people like Trump generally get their way, we won't have to worry about the fringe left or the fringe right. You won't have to worry about them being violent. There won't be an impetus towards violence at that point. Unless you don't solve the immigration issue, then both sides will continue to be very, very angry indeed. You see, we've made our bed. Now it's time to make the bed in a different way. Let's try tidying it up a little bit so we can get some sleep. That's about